Welcome to the sixth and last event of our COVID in South Asia series here at the Center for Contemporary South Asia at the Watson Institute of Brown University. I am Ashutosh Varshne, director of the center, and it's a true privilege to welcome Barkha Dutt back to our center, if only virtually. She is right now in Surat, Gujarat, and will give her talk from there, from the road. We have seen Barkha as part of our community since the fall of 2011, when she was the first Meera and Vikram Gandhi Fellow at our center. And she started writing her 2015 book, The Unquiet Land, at the center. For roughly 2 decades, a little over 2 decades, she was with NDTV. And after leaving NDTV, she set up her own news and event company, Mojo, which she is currently is founder and CEO. She'll speak to us today on COVID in India. She has been on the road with the pandemic, which is also the title of this seminar, for the last 52 days. Once it was clear that the outbreak was serious, she chose to leave the comfort of studios in Delhi and hit the ground, reporting from UP, Haryana, Punjab, Madhya Pradesh, Rajasthan, and now finally Gujarat. And it's possible that I have missed one state, a state or two. And I'm sure if flights and trains were available, she would also be in Kerala, reporting from the most successful case of virus control, of COVID control worldwide, along with South Korea, Taiwan, and Vietnam, as The Economist reported this morning. Our format is as follows. We'll have roughly 3 half-hour segments. The first half hour after this introduction belongs to Barkha's presentation and talk from Surat. And it will be followed by a segment when we'll ask a panel of discussants to ask questions. And the panel I'll introduce when we get to about 10 o'clock. And then the last half hour of this seminar will be devoted to questions from the audience. Right through this webinar, those from in different parts of the world can type your questions into the Q&A part or function of the Zoom broadcast. And if you're watching on YouTube, then you can also type in your questions, and we have someone tabulating those questions here and pass it on to the panel. So one technical note, we are experimenting with a new technology, new technological form actually. Our seminars so far have been confined to the Brown community, and we are now branching out to reach an international audience through this technology. If the technology falters a little, please bear with us. The technological team at the Watson Institute will fix the problem as soon as possible. With that, let me invite Barkha Dutt to give her talk and make her presentation from Surat, Gujarat. Welcome, Barkha.
Thank you so much, Professor Varshne, and all the other old friends and new friends at the Watson Institute. It's wonderful to be on. If you're wondering why I'm looking the way I am and where I am exactly, let me first give you a sense of where we are. I'm in this car of mine that has clocked more than 7,000 kilometers over the last 52, now 53rd day. We have traveled across 7 states. Gujarat is our 7th state, and we will be heading to Maharashtra tomorrow. So 8 states by tomorrow. I have to wear this because if you're out anywhere in India, other than inside your home, You have to wear a mask. It is required by law, which is why I apologize that I have to wear this mask, but I'm sure some of this is happening in your neck of the woods as well. So I want to talk a little bit about my experiences over the last 52, 53 days. I set out imagining that I would be reporting mostly from hospitals, that I would be telling the stories of doctors and nurses and health workers and patients, that I would be learning the science as we went along of this pandemic. And I am doing some of that. I have reported from inside now 4 COVID hospitals across India. I have been inside the isolation wards. I have been to quarantine centers. But somewhere along the way, I ended up discovering that unique to India became a completely different set of issues. And these were an emerging humanitarian set of crises around the poorest of our poor. When the Prime Minister decided to lock down, and we are now in the 3rd phase of a national lockdown, albeit with some restrictions lifted in this 3rd phase. But when the Prime Minister first decided to lock India down, I think we all understood that this was an inevitable moment. And I think that there was a great amount of support for the government in the initial phase when the government decided to do this. And people said it was bold, it was risky, but it was necessary, because everybody understood that asking 1.3 billion people, the world's biggest democracy, to hunker down wasn't going to be simple. But I think as the days went along, what became clear is that we had not paid enough thought to what would happen to the poorest Indian citizens, in particular, the migrant workers of India. Now, who are the migrant workers of India? All of you political scientists, sociologists, anthropologists have studied this much better than I have. But if there are people out there who are lay people like me, it simply means transient workers, a transient workforce that has their home in the village, but comes to live in the city. And when they come to live in the city, oftentimes, most often, they are daily wagers. They don't have a permanent home. If they work on construction sites or factory sites, as so many of them do, they basically live on that piece of land till the house is built or the factory is built and so on. And because they are daily wagers and they often lived in very, very cramped and congested tenements that are provided to them by these owners, when the lockdown was announced, you suddenly had millions of Indians basically losing in one fell swoop their livelihood, their access to food, because many of them have homes in the village, even if they have ration cards, which is the identification that allows them access to the public distribution system of food. Those cards are registered elsewhere. They can't get access without cash to the food in the PDS system of India. And many of them are simply undocumented and do not have any identification. So what ended up happening was I set out to report the pandemic, and I found that I was reporting 2 stories simultaneously. I was telling the medical story of how the pandemic was playing out in India, but I was also looking at this completely heart-searing sort of crisis emerge before my eyes. And I have called these people, 45 million of them estimated to be migrants, India's invisible. I call them this because literally in the first 72 hours after the lockdown, I think we witnessed a mass exodus of people that is comparable only to India's partition. I last saw this scale of movement, this mass movement of human beings across different parts of the country only during the partition in 1947. And I decided to go out and walk with them. I couldn't walk as much as they could. Many of them were walking hundreds of kilometers. I walked short stretches with them. But wherever I could, I would walk with them. I would talk to them. And I still remember what one of them said to me. And he said to me as he walked from Delhi to Uttar Pradesh, which is hundreds of kilometers away, he said to me, "Are only the poor going to die in India? And are we not being given buses just because we're poor? Has no one even thought of giving us buses to send?"
Now, what I'm going to do is actually maybe
pull up some images, if we can, to show you some of the images from my journey. And I want to just show you the first few images. I'm just going to ask my producer Prashanti to try and bring these up. And please bear with me. We're doing this on a phone by the roadside on borrowed Wi-Fi. So you have to forgive us if this is not as smooth as some of the webinars you're used to. Now, this lady, her name is Taravati. And I met her, she's just one of the many people that I walked with. And I name her because I think that when we say migrant workers, we treat them as this bulk commodity. They really are individuals. She was walking from Delhi to Aligarh with her little children. And I met so many people like this. There you can see Taravati carrying that red bag, and that's her daughter. And you see in her hand, if you look closely, a packet of biscuits, and her children had a slice of bread. And this is because volunteers on the road had decided to distribute some food. But in the first few days, the people I met had no access to food. So they would pack up a little bit of salt and roti, and they would put it in their bags. And, you know, I actually say the women were carrying the universe on their heads, because that little bag is pretty much their whole life belongings. This is reverse migration happening, and they're walking with this. This image, I called India's Great Wall of Inequality. So I think what this pandemic did and the lockdown thereafter is basically wrench open all of our class biases. We are a hierarchical, very stratified society. And to me, as I watch these men, and this big wall you see is actually of one of our super expressways. And I saw these men walking hundreds of kilometers below it, and I thought that this was the Great Wall of Inequality. And, you know, here, this story particularly stays with me. This was a 5-year-old child, and the child's name is Pankaj, and his mother's name was Poonam. Once again, you will see there's a pattern here. The women carry the belongings, and the men carry the children. And they were going to Morena in Madhya Pradesh. And I particularly remember this family because I saw some people offering them food, and they said to these people that we have a packed lunch, so please keep the food for someone who may needs it more. All along these highways, and this is not particular to any state. I have seen this now in every state I've been to, and as I said, I'm now reaching my 8th Indian state tomorrow. The one pattern that would emerge is that there was a desperation to get home. There was a desolation in almost all cases, despite the government order that said that migrant workers must be paid full salaries. This order was not being followed. And the order was in a way meaningless because these poor people are not going to go into a police station or into a court and say that our sake, as they call their employers, is not giving us money. And we saw a number of flip-flops from the government. That's another man I met, and he worked as a contract labor in a car company in Gurgaon, which is on the outskirts of Delhi. And he's the one who said that are only the poor destined to die? Do we not even deserve a bus? And then I remember one other comment he made, and he said, will any politician's child die in this pandemic? I don't think so. I think only we are going to die. And he was walking hundreds of kilometers home. Now, I'm just going to leave you with this image on your screen, and we'll come back to it. I want to talk a little bit about what we've seen thus far. And basically, I want to talk a little bit about why the confusion occurred. The confusion occurred because in the beginning, the government did not factor in that there would be this kind of panic and fear and economic and hunger-driven exodus. When they started waking up to it, there was very little coordination between the states. The states were not able to agree on who should take responsibility for these workers. We lost about 72 hours in this. When finally the handful of us, and that's the other thing I'll talk a little bit about later, television news basically flunked this story. It sat it out. There were very, very few of us actually out there telling these stories. But when these images started to make their impact felt, the government was compelled to provide buses for some of these workers. But when the buses were organized, you saw suddenly a deluge, a flood, which became the opposite of social distancing. When that happened, the government panicked again and issued a new order saying that the movement of the workers was a violation of the lockdown. So we went back to having no transport for these workers, and we went back to on highway after highway, seeing them walk the streets of India. Now, on your screen, you see this is as recently as a few days ago, and I just want to make the point that this is not specific to a state. No matter which state I go to, no matter which highway I move on, I have seen images like this. And this lady, her name was Seema. She had tried 3 times to go to the border to get across, and 3 times the police sent her back saying, "You don't have the requisite papers to cross." Those are her 4 children. The littlest child is on her husband's back. And, while she was talking to me, she just collapsed. She just collapsed in tears. And she said, "I'm really tired." That's Seema. And I had to, at this point, in our interviews, we try and maintain some level of social distancing, but it had to be abandoned unless I was going to be this really cold, feelingless person. And I just held her and I said, "What can we do for you?" And she said, "Just send me home. I'm so tired. I cannot walk anymore." And so, this story of India's migrant workers has begun to almost overshadow what's happening with the medical crisis, and we'll talk about that a little bit in a moment. Here I met cement workers. These are cement workers who work in Rajasthan, and they really brought home the breakdown of trust between owners and workers. One of the things that I've been saying to people is, if the plight and the trauma of migrant workers does not move your conscience, if you don't feel that we failed them as a nation, be transactional, think about the economy. These men told me that after how their factory owners have treated them, they will never come back. Now, as India is trying to reopen factories, our workers are just, here's the irony. We've just begun to lift restrictions, but this is the exact point where we finally begun to organize trains and buses for these men, women, and often children to go back home. And these cement workers from Rajasthan told me, "We are never, ever coming back to work." And in many cases, I saw women, I saw children, I've seen children walking barefoot. Oftentimes, they don't have any food. And, one doesn't even know what to say to them to make them feel better. Like I said, children have been a huge presence on the streets of India. And this is, I think this will remain one of the biggest failures of this moment. That's another father carrying a little child on his back. And in every case, the story is the same. No wages, no work. And there you see, that's a little child walking barefoot. I just want to hold this image and let it sink in. That is, a child younger than 8 years old. He's going to walk hundreds of kilometers barefoot on our highways trying to get home. So for me, reporting the COVID story has almost become reporting 2 completely different stories. The lockdown has become a different crisis, and the pandemic has become a different crisis. And, this video, we'll just see if we can play it for you. This was 3 in the morning. This was actually 3 in the morning, and we were stopped at a police barricade. And, even then there were people, some people were cycling. We met people who were cycling from Haryana to Bihar. So the point I'm trying to make is that no matter which highway, no matter what mode of transport, these are men who work as blanket weavers in Panipat in Haryana, and they were going 1,300 kilometers to Bihar. And they were, they didn't have masks. We had some extra masks, so we gave them masks. I asked them what you were going to eat, and they said, well, we had Parle G biscuits, or the glucose biscuits, and they're finished. Our water has finished. We met many of them who've been pawning their phones for a few hundred rupees, and so that they can get some money to buy food along the way. And then, of course, there's the police that has to be dealt with. The police oftentimes is very, very hostile, and is often sometimes even abusive and violent. Now, if you can just, okay, I'm going to come back to this in a moment. If you can just come back to me now, I just want to, before I go to the next set of images, the point that one is trying to make is that we understand that India is a kind of unique, a very unique country. And, we understand that when we're talking about the scale of inequality, this is an emerging economy, that none of this is easy. And we are in a health system where there is 0.55 beds for every 1,000 people. Our doctors are fewer than the prescribed World Health Organization limit. So this was never going to be easy. But the fact is that I am worried today that the humanitarian crisis of a continued lockdown is much bigger than the crisis that the pandemic would have inflicted, especially since, I'll talk a little bit about the medical situation, especially since thus far, for reasons the scientists have not been able to fully comprehend, the fatalities rate in India is very low in a relative way compared to the rest of the world. Nobody knows quite why this is. There have been theories about whether it's the temperature. There's been theories about whether it's our earlier exposure to zoonotic viruses, whether our immunity is greater because we're a hardier people, or because whether our poorer people have often lived with exposure to all kinds of viruses. We simply do not know. The director of the All India Medical Institute has been warning that we might still be short of our peak. Our peak may come only in June or July. But I think there are now serious questions about whether this lockdown should continue. At least personally, I've become a skeptic. I've gone from being a complete votary of the first lockdown to being a skeptic about the third one. And it's basically because of these complete humanitarian tragedies that I've seen day after day after day. And when I look at the numbers of or the death rate, frankly, 1,300 Indians die from tuberculosis every day. 1,300 Indians die from cancer every day. So those are daily figures. And, our cumulative fatalities are nowhere close to some of these figures on a weekly or even on a 2 days or 3 days basis at a time. So we are dealing with something very, very unique that no other part of the world is actually dealing with. And this in some cases has meant death from poverty, from exhaustion. We're talking to you on a day when a goods train ran over 15 migrant workers asleep on the rail tracks in Maharashtra. They were asleep on the rail tracks because they were so tired from walking that they just slept on the tracks. In another part of India, in Telangana in the south, a bus carrying migrant workers ran into a truck. And there are other really, really searing tragedies, and I'm going to bring up the pictures once again. I met a migrant worker, or rather I met the family of a migrant worker who had to sell his phone. He used to do the odd job as a painter. He used to paint houses. Let's just hold that image for a second. So his name was Mukesh Mandal, and Mukesh Mandal had to sell his phone for 2,500 rupees. And then with those 2,500 rupees, he bought a fan. Remember, it's really getting to be very hot in India. He bought a fan for 500 rupees. He used a few hundred rupees to buy some wheat and rice. He handed the rest of his money to his wife. And then in this tenement that he lives in, he basically took a cloth, strung himself to a bamboo pole and killed himself. And, this was the first suicide triggered by economic hardship that I reported on. But I was beginning to feel really anxious when I started seeing that there were cases like this. And that's me in Mukesh Mandal's tenement. That is his family. This is another story. This is in a village in Madhya Pradesh. I'm sitting with the family of a migrant worker called Ranveer Singh. Ranveer Singh was part of the first exodus of migrant workers from the capital to his village in Madhya Pradesh, which was 302 kilometers away. I remember this number so well because this is such a horrible story. Ranveer Singh, 80 kilometers short of home, walking on foot the whole way, calls his sister and says, "My chest is tightening, I feel I can't breathe." The sister says, "Can you please rest? Just stay where you are." He spends the night at the railway station in Agra. And his last call, which I happen to hear, I have the audio of that call. His last call is, "Please, something is happening to me. Please come and fetch me if you can." The family manages to get a curfew pass from the local administration, drives to him, but as they drive to him, it's already too late. He dies from a heart attack. 80 kilometers short of home. So, we are actually seeing deaths that are taking place. We'll come back to these medical images. If we can just come back to me now, and before we show you the next set of pictures, we are seeing actual fatalities that are arising from economic hardship. The specter of starvation and hunger is extremely real. Where I am right now, Surat. Surat has an estimated 15 lakh migrant workers. They power diamond factories here, textile factories here, construction site companies. And I was at a railway station earlier today, and I was meeting some of them, and I said, why are you going home? Now the restrictions have begun to lift. Why are you going home? And they said, well, the way we've been treated, we don't want to be here. And one pattern I find is where employers have behaved better, where they've been a bit benign, where they've been a bit benevolent, where they've bought a ticket or given them food, there you have workers say, I just want to go home for a while and I'll come back. But a lot of people, that relationship of trust has totally broken down. And chief ministers I've been talking to in different states are really worried about this reverse migration that is taking place and whether we're ever going to see these men, women, and children, because there are children among them, come back to our cities to work. Now, I'm going to shift our focus a little bit to the hospitals and what's happening inside the hospitals. Now, India, as you know, has a sort of very poor ratio of hospital beds to patients. 0.55 is what I said earlier. And this lockdown was really supposed to give breathing space to the public health system like everywhere else in the world. It's the public health system, at least in India, that's had to carry the responsibility. And this lockdown was meant to give breathing space to the hospitals to prepare themselves. We went through the usual crises of under-testing, of not enough PPE kits, of having to change the standardization for the protective gear so that we could have enough of them. This is an image from inside Indore. I was inside one of the COVID hospitals. And this was a bit of a life-affirming moment because there were a lot of pregnant women and new mothers, and these are doctors who were able to save some lives. And that's me reporting with these doctors inside that COVID hospital. This is a story that I really do want to share. And sorry, you can see a bit of our tripod in one corner, but this is the mortuary. This is the mortuary of a COVID hospital in Indore in Madhya Pradesh. And the reason I paused to tell this story is that we have seen again something unfortunate happening on the sidelines of this crisis, which is religious tensions. Now, this began because there was a congregation that took place of an Orthodox Sunni sect called the Tablighi Jamaat. The Tablighi Jamaat, which has influence across 150 countries, so it's actually quite a widely spread sect, first met in Malaysia in February of this year. And from there, it is now well documented that congregation in Malaysia became a virus super spreader, and the virus spread across Southeast Asia. Despite that, what ended up happening was that many of the attendees at that congregation were able to come back into India, and then another congregation was held at the international headquarters of the Tablighi Jamaat, which is in Delhi in an area called Nizamuddin. Now, what we know is that by that time, the Delhi government had issued an order that no more than 200 people should gather at any place. But a few thousand people gathered at this congregation, clearly defying the Delhi government order. However, there was a police station right next to the Tablighi Jamaat, and the police station could have stopped it, and we don't know why they didn't. We don't know why foreign visas were not suspended earlier and how these people managed to get into the country. This background is important because it became an opportunity for some rabble-rousers, for some of our shameful television networks to actually use the pandemic as an instrument of hate, and to use it as an opportunity to smear all Indian Muslims, and to use words like Corona Jihad. These were mainlined, you could hear them on some of the television networks, and that now brings me to this story. This story is of Hindu mortuary workers who are burying the Muslims who are dying in Indore, because remember, funerals and burials have very stringent protocols now. And I interviewed these 4 wonderful men, and I said to them, do you not feel scared? And they said, of course we do. So I said, so then? And I said, you're burying someone from another faith? And they said, humanity before religion. And remember, in India, those who perform the burials and the last rites is quite linked to a hierarchical caste system. So otherwise, these are men who would be shunned by those who are prejudiced and look at life through the prism of caste. But these for me were in some ways even bigger heroes than the frontline warriors because they just showed the basic humanism at a time where the discourse in India has been coarsened by religious bigotry. We can move on now to the next image. That's me at the mortuary reporting on these Hindu mortuary workers, and those are one of those images. And finally, to the state where I'm in. That is Ahmedabad. I'm in Surat right now, but that is Ahmedabad. That is the government COVID facility. It's 1,200 bed COVID facility. It was inaugurated by the Prime Minister. It's quite a swanky medical complex. Now, this is a state where actually more people are dying from the coronavirus than in most other parts of the country. I think only West Bengal has a higher mortality rate than Gujarat. And so I spent a lot of time trying to understand why more Gujaratis are actually dying. Again, the science is not clear on that. Is it a greater incidence of comorbidities? Is it a different strain of the virus? I think we haven't figured that out yet. But if in other parts of the country, the fatalities rates remain relatively low, making India an outlier in Gujarat, where I am right now, it is indeed quite high. That is Punjab, another part of my journey. That's another COVID hospital in Punjab. And that is a place where a lot of people from a Gurdwara in Maharashtra called the Hazur Sahib Gurdwara in Nanded, Maharashtra. A lot of the Sikhs from there returned to Punjab, leading to a sharp spike in cases. So once again, like with the Tablighi Jamaat, the problem was mass congregation. And I wonder really if how religions conduct themselves, how worship is now done, will change once and for all. But in this particular case, we did not see the kind of coarsened discourse that involved Muslims. Here they were just quarantined. They were all asymptomatic. India is dealing with a massive number of asymptomatic patients. So all of the people, the Sikh pilgrims who returned from Nanded, many of them tested positive, but not even one of them had fever. So if we can just come back to me now. That was just a kind of roller coaster
Sorry
set
to
of images. Yes.
Yeah, lastly, you wanted me to remind you when you were 5 minutes close to the end.
Yes. So I'll just take another 5 minutes to give an overview. I think here's what it looks like to me. 3-4 things. One, we do not understand yet whether this data, the statistics in terms of the casualties, the mortality rate will remain. If it does, then India may have ducked a bullet for reasons that science has not understood yet. Doctors are warning that we've got to wait till June or July to understand what's happening. At the same time, the viability and the desirability of the lockdown has become a huge question because the number of people who have said to me that poverty and the hardship would kill us before the virus will are now too many to count. We have seen instances of great humanity, great heroism in these moments, but we have also seen some of our darkest sides and our deepest prejudices exposed. We have seen a failure by large sections of big media that has refused to come out and tell the story, that has remained confined within television, interviewing the same 3.5 people every day. And it is a mystery why television has chosen to do that. The story has been told mostly by a small group of independent journalists and some stellar city reporters from some of our newspapers. But you will not find the big television channels sending their reporters out at all. And lastly, something I haven't touched upon, and then I'll pause, is we are dealing with another social problem, which is the stigmatization of our health workers, our doctors, our domestic health. We are seeing social prejudices erupt from the underbelly and come out on the surface. And so I have interviewed nurses and doctors who have been mobbed and pelted with stones, who are being asked to leave their homes, to vacate their homes, because there's such a fear and paranoia around this virus, even though the data tells us India may have so far really dug the worst. So I'm going to actually just pause here because I know a lot more will emerge from our conversation. But this is an overview of my travels on the road with the pandemic.
All right, so thank you very much for this remarkable overview, a sharing overview actually. And let me now turn to our panel of discussants. Patrick Heller, Professor of Sociology, is joining us. Bhrigupati Singh, Assistant Professor of Anthropology, joining us. Anindita Adhikari, an advanced PhD student working with migrants of the COVID crisis, joining us from Delhi. And Bhanu Joshi will be a PhD student here in political science at Brown, joining us from Providence, and I'm in Boston. Bhanu will put together the questions for you for the third half hour. But let me start this segment with one question that I have to pose, and then others will ask one or two questions. And that's all the time we'll have. I want to follow up on the Tablighi Jamaat issue. Now, if we cast our net wider and go internationally, then we note that religious congregations in general have been super spreaders in this crisis. So, for example, the Orthodox Jews are about 12% of Israel, but add up to 60% of infections in Israel. A church in South Korea was a super spreader, though South Korea controlled the spread of the virus very quickly and very well. But it all began with a church in South Korea. We also have the story, and you can tell us more about this. We also have the story of a Sikh preacher from Punjab going to northern Italy to preach and then comes back and becomes the source of super spreading in Punjab. So what happened at the Tablighi Jamaat congregation in Nizamuddin in Delhi, was there something specific about that event or that occurrence? Was it something specific there, or was it straightforwardly inserted into a communal narrative, ignoring all these reports that were appearing on religious congregations in general? So are we talking about Tablighi Jamaat as a special example, or as a specific example of religious congregations in general? Or was there something very specific about what happened there which sets it apart from other religious congregations?
So I think that's a really important question. And I want to also draw everyone's attention to the fact that I was in Punjab, and more than that one preacher, Ashutosh, that you referred to, we now have an entire Gurdwara in Maharashtra called the Hazur Sahib Gurdwara, from where 3,500 Sikh pilgrims have been taken home to Punjab, and a majority of them have tested positive, asymptomatic but positive. So we do now know a living example of another religious congregation within India that has actually clearly displayed the perils of religious congregations, but has not been subjected to the same sort of scrutiny or slander. One of the reasons for that, of course, is by the time this congregation moved, our quarantine systems were in better place. So these Sikhs did not emerge as super spreaders because they were able to be brought back and placed into quarantine. Whereas what happened with the Tablighi Jamaat was that this was before we woke up to what was happening, the scale of what was happening. And so the attendees from the Tablighi Jamaat were able to travel to different parts of India. And it's now documented that 30% of India's cases can be traced back to the congregation. I would also like to add, as a ferocious, I'm a ferocious pluralist, and I can't stand the kind of communalization of this pandemic discourse that we've seen. But that said, the Tablighi Jamaat's leadership did itself no favors by its main Maulana not coming out in public. His own followers have been vulnerable. His own people are ill. And I believe that he should have come out much sooner than he has. And the kind of statements that we saw from the Orthodox leadership were not at all progressive. But has there been an attempt by certain sections, by certain television networks to smear Indian Muslims? Absolutely. is it acceptable? Not at all. Is it shameful? Absolutely. So I think a lot of these things, Ashu, exist simultaneously. The Tablighi Jamaat was carelessly irresponsible and criminally negligent. Its leadership, a number of my Muslim friends, a number of eminent Muslim citizens from Javed Akhtar to Professor Irfan Habib have called Tablighi Jamaatis the enemies of Islam. But the kind of pretext to suddenly use language like corona jihad, I mean, it's disgusting. It's absolutely disgusting that we can find this pandemic and, at a time when this country should be together, to basically find one more excuse to demonize Indian Muslims.
Thank you. Let me now turn to Patrick Heller. Patrick, you'll have one question to begin with, and then we'll see whether we can have two. Yeah.
Barkha, let me just begin by thanking you for your extraordinary reporting. I mean, what you've done is courageous and so important, and bringing light to the plight of migrant workers. As you say, the media just hasn't covered it. And the question I want to ask you about is whether the government's abysmal failure to anticipate the migrant problem, to call a lockdown without taking any advanced measures to address their plight, as you understand it, is this because they were ignorant? Did they literally just not recognize the scale of that particular problem? Or is it, as you've suggested, essentially about indifference, the indifference of elites towards the plight of the poor in a society that is incredibly hierarchical?
Thank you, Patrick. I think it's a combination of both. The fact is that the lockdown was announced by the government at 8 p.m. One evening, and the lockdown was supposed to kick in from midnight. Now, 4 hours is not enough for a country to get its act together. So I think that not enough thought went into this. I think this was a gigantic oversight, a failure to anticipate that there would be this kind of exodus. I think the sense was that when the first 21-day lockdown was announced, that people would stay put where they are because that's what they were asked to do. And there was this sense that this would happen and that you could issue government advisories ordering people to pay full wages. And if full wages were paid, then people would stay where they were. The problem began because nobody paid, in most cases, people did not pay. And these were daily wages. And so it began with the failure to anticipate, and it ended up being this kind of indifference of the elites. It's not happening to me, so it's not happening. And I just think that, the ultimate sort of comeuppance will be if factories are unable to open or reopen because these workers refuse to come back. And I have met any number of workers who are now saying that after how we've been treated, we do not wish to go back.
Yes, thank you. Let's turn to Bhrigupati Singh. Can you switch on your, I think your video, switch it on, yeah. Yes.
Yeah, great. Thank you, Ashu. Hi, Barkha. And like Patrick, I wanted to thank you for the incredible work you're doing. And actually my question builds on what Patrick was saying, which is to emphasize, I had two questions. One was about the importance of a global perspective at this moment. Second is about urban poor Muslim neighborhoods. So we'll see if we have time for both. The first thing I wanted to tell you was that, so from the perspective of social science, we are trying to do various things. Like I'm part of a social science COVID network where we are trying to do the same household survey in 5 countries on a bi-weekly basis to keep track of some of the endemic difficulties. But it's quite surprising to hear colleagues in other countries, and these are not resource-rich countries, countries like South Africa, to hear them talk about what the measures were. Simple things like how many days notice was given before the lockdown, or how well do you know the transit points in your cities where people will congregate in such a moment. It's basic common sense in terms of planning. So I was thinking that, you are one of the very few television journalists in India who has an international reach. You have a gift alongside frontline reporting for animating debate. All of us have watched you for years on We the People and many, many other shows. So I was wondering, it might be quite exciting to hear if you were to suppose do 2 other or 3 other equivalents of people like you, or at the forefront of cutting edge sort of journalism, But from an analytic perspective, in say any 3 different countries, South Africa would be a very good example, and because what will happen within 2 weeks, I would say, probably, is that a discourse will ossify that what Modi ji did was inevitable. These are the things that people are using the adjectives. It was necessary, and that he brought us all together. Quite obfuscating a basic reality that there have been a series of avoidable political catastrophes, some of which you are highlighting, but which also need to be highlighted that there are other countries where there are far fewer or equivalent resources, where actually through simple measures the situation was handled better. So could we think of something, could you think of something, Watson, Ashu, you could organize it? It basically, there's some highlighting needs to be done to provide a counter narrative to what will very soon become assimilated into this nationalist sort of clapping and coming together kind of narrative. But thank you for the incredible work you're doing.
Thank you, Vikram. Thank you. And I think it would be, sorry, I'll just briefly respond to that. I think it would be very instructive to compare and learn from what other countries have done. But just picking up on the United States, for example, where I know that the progressive pressure is to not open, in India, the pressure from progressives is to open. So it's quite different, just to point out that little contrast. Here, I think it's the government, and why just the government? Even state governments want to keep the lockdown, and the rest of us are saying it's not viable anymore. It's just hurting the poor too much, and the fatalities just don't seem to show a cause and effect relationship. But yes, it would be extremely instructive to study other countries and what they did or did not do with the same resources available.
But in terms of the basic framing of what happened in the last 1 month, was it something that brought everyone together, or was it a series of avoidable political catastrophes? Even that narrative is not fully settled yet, which you can influence, I think, quite significantly and are already doing.
Did you hear that, Barkha?
Yeah, so I mean, I think that it's a bit of both. If you ask me what's the mood in the country right now, I don't think people believe that the lockdown was wrong. I think most people that I've met, including migrant workers, don't oppose the lockdown. What they say, like even this afternoon at the railway station, one of the migrant workers going home to Bihar said to me, if only Modi ji had given us a little time to get to our village. That's all he said. He didn't oppose the lockdown. He understood the reason for the lockdown. He said in Hindi, thoda waqt mil jata, ghar jaane ke liye ghar pahunch jate. If I had just a little bit time, I would have been able to reach my village. I want to make one point that I haven't actually touched upon. There was a time when the Bihar Chief Minister was a great favorite of Indian liberals. He has been singularly the worst Chief Minister that we have seen in this pandemic. I don't usually make personal comments, but I am really angry at the number of impoverished workers from Bihar that I have met in state after state. And there hasn't been another chief minister who has refused to take back his people. He has said at every stage in this crisis, till the center decided to send the workers home, that this is a violation of the lockdown. I will neither take the stranded Bihar students in Kota, nor will I take the migrant workers. Please stay where you are. I have never in my life seen a public representative who refuses to take back his people into the state.
Yes, Brigu, maybe we'll come back to you if we have time for the second question. Let's go to Anindita now from Delhi. Anindita is in Delhi, yeah.
Hi, Barkha, and thank you for all your work. So I have a question that actually follows up on what you just said about Bihar, and what it actually exposes. What it exposes us to is really the variation in the capacity of different states to respond both to the humanitarian crisis, but also to the health crisis. And really the flip-flop that we see, the Bihar government is also, by the way, one of the two high migrant sending states that actually put out a scheme for cash relief for over 17 lakh migrants, was one of the first states to announce this. So it's not entirely true that they've done nothing. At the same time, the fact that the chief minister is publicly refusing to take back migrants is really exposing the incapacity of public health in the state. So given that you've traveled across different states, I had two questions. One is, what are the differences that you're seeing in the way different states are handling the migrant worker crisis first? And secondly, sort of the greater burden of this humanitarian crisis is also once again falling on poorer states. And the role of the center to actually support these poorer states they've relinquished that role almost entirely, both in the way that they've handled, in the announcement of the central relief package, but now, by decentralizing kind of the return of migrants to their states, they've also washed their hands of the crisis. So one is poorer states. The second is, since you've been in both Gujarat and Haryana, these are both high migrant receiving states. Do you see a difference in the way, you'd imagine that Gujarat perhaps has better capacity, Haryana and Gujarat have better capacity. So do you see differences in the way they're dealing with migrant states? I mean, I have my own insights based on the work that we've been doing as part of the Stranded Workers Action Network, but I really want to hear, since you've been on the road and aankhon dekha hai.
So my experience is...
The interstate differentials question has become absolutely central to the way we in the social sciences are looking at this problem now.
Sure.
Why are some states doing better than others? Given your travels and your experience in ground reporting, how would you come out on that?
So my answer, of course, would have to be anecdotal. I haven't used data to study this, so I'm only going to give you like anecdotal stories from the road. And Anindita, I do take your point that Nitish Kumar had announced the cash transfers, but I just feel like every Bihari migrant worker I've met seems to feel more orphaned, if that's the correct word to use, than others. It's almost like not having a paternalistic or a maternalistic state figure to turn to. It's like that. That said, I think you make a very good point about the absence of central relief to the states. Literally every state representative I've spoken to is talking about the sheer absence of any revenue. Punjab, for example, has an 88% drop in revenue. 88% drop. I mean, that is why so many states are pushing for liquor shops to reopen, because these are the only sources literally of revenue. GST dues have not been paid. There is no significant financial aid that is going from the center, and even states that have done very well. I was talking to Thomas Isaac in Kerala, and he was, he's saying like we're going to have lakhs of people coming back into Kerala as the evacuation takes place of Indians from across the globe, and we just literally do not know what we are going to do. That's one problem. The other problem is the center is not releasing money, but it's micromanaging, or the bureaucracy is micromanaging what can open and what cannot open. So you have chief ministers with a very strong sense of let's open A, B, C and let's keep C, D, E locked. But you will have a sort of a bureaucrat in Delhi who will say, no, this is a red zone, so all of it has to be closed. So in terms of economic revival, we actually have this enforced by law because of the National Disaster Management Act. So chief ministers are now calling for this to be amended so that they're not bound by the center's diktats. Is the burden falling on poorer states? Yes, it is, which is why you would need a centralized response without micromanagement. But for that, we need an absence of politics in this. And I think that doesn't happen in any country. It's not even happening, with the Democrats and the Republicans. Lastly, why are some states doing better? I think that states that have dealt with drought, famine, for example, before, they have a better muscle memory at handling crisis. So one of the first chief ministers to call for migrant trains was Rajasthan. Rajasthan called, first of all, in 2 different letters to the Prime Minister saying, send the migrants home. So, just to give you an example, not to say that, it's only Ashok Gehlot, but I think that there is a sense of administrations that have dealt with calamity before. I think they are certainly showing administrative muscle memory in dealing with this in a way that other states have failed to do. And the largest problem is the complete absence of coordination between states. My sense is that we are not able to get chief ministers to agree. If chief ministers were speaking to each other, we would never have seen the first exodus of migrant workers. Just to share, when I was walking with the migrant workers in the first 72 hours after the lockdown, at the borders, there was no state representation. So if, for example, a migrant worker was moving from Delhi into UP, at the border, other than the police, there was no one from Delhi government,
And there was no one from UP government. There was no one from, similarly at other borders, Haryana, Punjab, and so on. And then that, to your point, I do think some states have more capacity. But I think some of these problems were easily solvable. You actually don't need giant capacity to have solved these problems. You simply needed the sensitivity and the anticipation that what does a human being want? A human being wants to know that she will not go hungry, that her children will not go hungry, and that she will be safe. One of the things that, like I remember Ashok Gehlot told me, and I think there his administrative experience actually showed, he said that even if we give ration and food, workers are scared that if they fall ill, let's say they do get the coronavirus, they are going to not be at home, they're not going to be in a place that is familiar to them, and they'll have nobody around them. Their factory owners have already treated them so badly. So who's going to look out for them? So that human need that makes an Indian stranded in Norway or Dubai want to come back, that same human need exists in the migrant workers. But because we looked at them only through the prism of poverty, and we thought, okay, if we give them 5 kilos of wheat and we give them 2 kilos of rice, they're not like us. They don't want to go home. Like, there was a complete psychological failure to understand basic human psychology. And I thought that states that had greater experience with calamity showed that understanding. And I wish that Delhi had moved much faster on organizing these trains and sending these people home.
So Barkha, it seems to me, as we conclude this segment, it seems to me you're saying that it's both a failure of imagination on the part of decision-making elites, as well as elite callousness, both. I think you're making both points, aren't you, there, right? That at one level, there's a serious failure of political imagination or administrative imagination about, not anticipating how big the migrant exodus will be. That's surely something that could have been done, administratively anticipated, but was not. And once the migrants were on the road, then these are just poor people, and they will somehow manage. We don't have to do all that much. This seems to be what the political elite did on the whole, with the exception of some states, right?
Even the states that cared more or understood that this was going to be a catastrophe, I think didn't push the matter as hard as they did. Like, even in states with greater experience, we found migrant workers desolate. And it's not as if, with all his experience, even within Rajasthan, they were walking the highways. And what happened was that states where workers are working were not willing to take responsibility for them. So that means that if I'm a migrant from Bihar, if Bihar does not requisition buses to bring me back, Rajasthan won't do anything. Rajasthan will give me food to eat because activists and NGOs will make a noise and some media will make a noise, but it will not take the responsibility for how I get home. So this is the problem we've seen. We have seen problems in the federal cohesion administratively of India, because every chief minister is wanting to protect her or his backyard and not want their own numbers to spike.
Right, but that's where the issue of federal leadership or central leadership becomes very important. This question has emerged in America also, as you know, and for example, different states competing with one another to get the PPE, and it's clear that unless there was a collective leadership on PPE, on the supply of ventilators, which was finally managed, but on PPE or on testing, it was not easy for any given state, any single state to handle the problem. And in any case, interstate coordination is primarily an issue for the central government or the federal government to handle, right?
I agree with that. And I wish that there had been more. I think there are two things that I feel. I wish the lockdown had been imposed earlier, and I wish it had been imposed with more time for these conversations to take place and this planning to take place. I'm not against the lockdown has served a useful purpose in what it's done to the numbers. And there are others who do data better who've shown that. But one, I'm against its continuing in this form, and two, with the benefit of hindsight, I wish it had been done earlier, but certainly with more time. I think the Prime Minister and the Chief Minister should have had many rounds of meetings before this lockdown, before we went into lockdown. And therefore, if they thought of it earlier, if the country had thought of it earlier, we would have left ourselves more time to plan this differently.
Okay, let's now turn to to Bhanu Joshi, who has been collecting questions for the last segment. And let's see how many questions we can accommodate or how many there are. So Bhanu, can you ask? Can you start with one or two? Let's start with one question, and then let's see where how many questions we can accommodate. We have up to 20 minutes.
Yeah. So we have received a few questions on both YouTube and Zoom chat. So I would try and organize them in some form. So first set of questions are around the role of NGOs and civil society organizations. And perhaps Barkha and Oni, who's also part of the Standard Workers Action Network, could weigh in. The question is that, were there cases of states, cities, local citizens and NGOs giving food to walking migrant workers? Were you able to talk to government officials on why they did not consider giving food, water for humanitarian purposes?
I mean, I spoke to government official after government official, but in no state is a government official ever ready to concede that a person is going hungry. To use the word starvation or hunger in India is a very politically loaded nomenclature. Even when I reported the stories of the migrant worker, for example, who sold his phone and then killed himself, the local administration was not willing to accept that this was hunger driven, right? So they kept saying to me that he was depressed. Oh, he had mental health problems and so on. So it's very difficult in India to get a government official to first acknowledge that people are going hungry. So if we say that, you know, they're walking because they feel they'll starve, a typical government response would be they're not starving, so why are they walking? Instead of addressing the issue that they are walking anyway, whether or not they're starving, they're walking. They're walking because they're desperate, they're desolate, they don't have income and they're not secure. And this failure to understand the notion of a citizen's security. See, we can do all the data and all the science we want, but if we don't understand the basic notion of the need for security, we will not understand this crisis. Hunger is one part of it, the need to be home is another part of it, feeling displaced when you already don't belong somewhere is a very, very big part of it. So I thought that every time we saw people who were going hungry, either people would ring us up and ask, why didn't you give them food? We gave them whatever we had, but it's not sustainable that our 4-member traveling team can feed workers along the highway. So we finally started appealing to people that if you see somebody walking past, please feed them. It was just like, it became like this appeal system. Finally, the government did set up temporary shelters. There were state governments that announced that there are temporary shelters, but communication dissemination was a big problem. I found that there were a lot of schemes that people were just not aware of. I don't know where they were being announced, but it was not trickling down. So that sort of community trickle down was not happening. Sometimes I would say to people, why are you walking? There's a Rain Bisera, there's a night shelter. They'd be like, those shelters are either full or we don't know about them. If we told people, for example, that you could get ration at so-and-so store, they'd say that 5 kilometers away. If we try and get there in the lockdown, the police doesn't let us go past the barricade. So we had lots of cases where the right hand of the system was not talking to the left hand of the system. And therefore, even if there was a good order that was implemented, for example, a government saying that you don't need a ration card to get ration. You go, it'll be need-based. That ration shop would be X number of kilometers away from a neighborhood or a village. And that villager could not get past the police barricade. And this notion of the lockdown becoming a police curfew. You know, in many parts of the country treated the lockdown as if it was a police curfew. They're two different things. We also, please remember, we're the only country in the world that shut down public transport. We shut down public transport. There was a skeletal bus service. Most people, to get anywhere, had to walk. To walk, they had to get past police barricades. And policing is a whole different debate for another time. But that lack of cohesion really played itself out.
Anu, next question.
Anidita, do you want to weigh in super quick?
If I can, in just 2 seconds, because this question about civil society's role is an important one, and it's also a reflection. It also mirrors how thick or thin the PDS coverage is in different spatially different. So the reason why you don't see civil society stepping in rural India is because PDS cover there is just better. So in Bihar, it's 85%. In a high visibility metropolitan area with dense industrial clusters like Gurgaon, the PDS coverage is less than 10%. So here you do need massive state intervention to be able to cover and cater to these households that are not in the existing public distribution system net. And this is where, I mean, I can say this based on working here, that the Gurgaon administration, for instance, doesn't have a handle on the numbers. They don't even know how many migrant workers there are in their district. And this was actually a question that was posed. The Ministry of Labour asked its own regional heads on the 3rd of April, how many stranded workers are there in your zone? And RTI was filed on the 10th of April asking the Ministry of Labour, do you have these numbers? And the Ministry of Labour's RTI reply was, these details are not available. So if you don't have the numbers of how many migrant workers there are, how will you provide them with rations? So they're working overnight, but they aren't being able to put systems in place. And therefore, the response of civil society has actually been perhaps in some ways more effective than the state in this crisis period. But it's a drop. It's a drop in the ocean.
The second question is something that we might expect in coming days. So, Barkha, the question is, how is the migrant exodus going to impact the destination states which are not undertaking proactive steps in ensuring safe and reliable transit opportunities to them?
By destination states, you mean the states where migrant workers come to work, right? I think it's too early to say, because right now there's a lot of anger. There's a lot of rage that I've sensed. You see, there are two kinds of emotions that one senses. One senses either in some cases this kind of helpless surrender to a system that seems a behemoth in which people are not finding a voice or a place, or you see rage. And where I have seen rage, I have seen people in multitudes now saying to me that they will not come back to work. They will not be coming back. So I really wonder how factories are going to reopen. There too, there's an elite sensibility that seems to feel there'll always be enough labor in India because there's so many poor people. This is how people talk. This is how people think. But I think that something could be shifting at this moment, because, you know, you've stripped away dignity from people, and there is nothing to suggest that a poor person does not demand the same level of dignity as you and I do. And so far, the feedback to me has been one where I sense that a lot of people will not be coming back.
Thank you for your answers. The second set of questions are on the statistics of the pandemic and how the data is being collected. The question is that when there is a political motivation to keep mortality counts low that affects the standards of attribution, what exactly is the process by which the central government is capturing fatality numbers from state government, and how do state governments in turn capture this from the hospitals? Are there any system of oversight?
So, I mean, we have the Indian Council for Medical Research, which is a central body doing this oversight, but we've already seen some controversies, the latest from West Bengal, where you've actually had leaked letters from smaller hospitals which have spoken of not showing COVID deaths as COVID deaths. You have a horrible case in a Mumbai hospital where you've seen dead bodies on a stretcher next to those who are being treated, and you have the hospital director saying that relatives are not willing to claim these bodies. So right now, you know, one has to go simply by the hospital data that is submitted to the state government, and the state government in turn passes it on to the center. And we have this official data to go by. I think it would need a overrunning of hospitals in the way that we have certainly not seen thus far, and I hope that remains the case, for us to begin examining, you know, whether there's unofficial data and there's official data. I think so far we have not had enough sort of prima facie sort of mass reporting of fatalities to be doing that.
Can I Bhanu, one second. Clearly, it seems to me a distinction might have to be drawn, Barkha, between infection statistics and death statistics. Thousands and thousands of infections, perhaps millions, can be hidden from public view if you're not testing, right? But thousands and thousands of death cannot be hidden. Cannot be hidden from you, right? You'll be wrong by a few hundred, maybe if, tens of, by 60, 70, by a few hundred, but you can't be wrong by thousands and hundreds of thousands.
That's just what I was saying, that you'd have to have your hospitals flooded with bodies for you to sort of start saying, oh, maybe we don't actually have the data on this. And that has not happened. So I absolutely agree that the one sort of conspiracy theory I don't buy at all is that countries can fudge their mortality rates. Because the point is that you simply, the scale of a pandemic in terms of its fatalities is impossible to hide. It is impossible to hide. Families talk, families grieve. There are local networks, and they could be, maybe some could go underreported, maybe some bodies could lie unclaimed, but because we have not seen that scale of casualties, there's simply no question of India not counting its dead properly or not counting the dead accurately. So there I completely emphasize that and agree with the point Ash.
Yes, Bhanu.
There are two more questions. Sticking to the data question, there is the question goes, the data is notoriously unreliable.
I just lost you.
Can you hear me now?
So Bhanu, do you have beyond data? What question?
I think there is a question on
no, I'm not able to
Jamaat and other organizations. The question is about Tablighi Jamaat's gathering in Nizamuddin.
Yeah.
And the question is that the gathering took place before lockdown, and while every other religious group were gathering and companies and organizations were conducting business as usual, in what way did Tablighi Jamaat do anything different than any other institution, religious or otherwise, which caused the kind of, this to be attributed to this organization?
Okay, is there any other question that we have had?
I didn't forget the chunk. I don't know.
There is a question on data which says that could Barkha comment on how
I went and watched. I was watching right now.
Has helped, how the testing capacity has been ramped up.
Hi guys.
Let's try a little bit more. Bhanu, you go on talking.
Yeah, so the other question was on testing capacity. And the question is that during lockdown, has the government of India ramped up its testing capacity, and how? And if, Barkha could have commented on that.
Yeah.
I can hear you now. I'm so sorry. I can hear you now.
Okay, so let me repeat that. Bhanu, what Bhanu said, others have already heard. Barkha, the question is, has there been, in your experience, a ramping up of testing capacity, or the question of testing is just being ignored because the more you test, the more infections you'll get?
No, I think that there are now people calling for more testing for sure. I do think that everybody acknowledges that we need to be testing much more than we have been. But there is a problem with testing in India that you have to link with social stigma. What's happening is that nobody volunteers to show up for a test, right? So it's not as if there's a flood of people who want a test who can't get one. We're having the opposite problem. The opposite problem is at least middle class and upper middle class Indians are refusing to get tested. One, because they feel that there will be a consequence for the neighborhoods they live in, for the societies they live in. And two, because they fear being placed in government-run quarantine centers, which are not comfortable, so to say. So we're having a very strange problem where even in private laboratories, testing is available, it's being underutilized. And there is no kind of random sampling testing happening, which is what we really need. We really need random testing. But there are state governments that are refusing to do this. For example, Telangana, I was interviewing K.T. Rama Rao, the chief minister's son and a minister in the government, and he said, I've got limited medical resources, I'm not going to do. He just flat out said, I'm not going to do. So, but on the other hand, you have an Amrinder Singh who is writing to the Prime Minister saying, I want more testing. And then you have our class of people who are refusing to get tested, even if the tests are a drive-in test at swanky laboratories. Our class is just refusing to get tested.
I see. So the problem is also one of the fear of stigmatization, basically, right? That's the social fear of stigmatization. All right. So now I think Bhanu, let me return to Brigu and Patrick. They still had a second question. If they want to ask it now, we have time. Brigu, I know you had a second question, so go ahead. Are you still there?
So maybe building on this question of stigmatization, I just wanted to emphasize how important, because of my own research, I'm on lots of WhatsApp groups in neighborhoods, and that Indore coverage, the Indore hospital coverage you did, has been forwarded a lot, because I think it addresses a very specific need that people are feeling right now. That in, like, when you speak on to households, there's a very striking difference between how, say, Hindu households feel part of this larger project and it's a period of difficulty. Muslim households, also similar attitude often, but are vulnerable to many kinds of rumor right now. Rumors as, that if you report any health problem, you'll be put in a camp, dead bodies are being thrown into a ditch. So just they're responding with fear, and that's the reason they're responding with fear. So that the Indore coverage where you just had that Hindu and Muslim bodies are being treated by mortuary workers with respect, or that there's that spontaneous applause in that video when you say insaniyat is bigger than. So that, it seems very ordinary, but it's actually circulating a lot, it seems to me, because it addresses a very specific kind of need of a sort of tasalli, of a sort that people need. That they are not going to be thrown in a ditch, or that Muslim bodies will not be cremated. So I was wondering if you could do more of that, in fact, and find more such vignettes in some ways that address a need that no media organization right now, in the mainstream media, is doing just the opposite. Or there's sort of expose from whatever little remains of the independent media, but that kind of seemingly ordinary coverage is actually making a very big difference, like you did in Indore.
Barkha.
So actually, it's so interesting that Brigu, you should say that, because there was another story from Indore of two doctors, and these were two doctors who went into a Muslim majority neighborhood, and they were pelted with stones. This is not happening only in Muslim neighborhoods. This is happening across neighborhoods where health workers have become creatures of suspicion, because they're either treated with fear, or there's a sense that hame le jaane aaye hain, they've come to take us away, or there's a paranoia that they'll spread the infection. And the television networks in India immediately jumped to the conclusion that this was Muslims attacking Hindus. And then I probed this story a little more, and I found that the two doctors who had been pelted were both women. One's name was Trupti and the other's name was Zakia. And they were Hindu. One was Hindu, the other was Muslim. So a Muslim doctor was among the doctors pelted in this Muslim neighborhood. And I brought them both on together, and they both said that they were closest of friends for years, did everything together, childhood, medicine. And they said that the one thing we do not need right now is the communalization of this attack on us. And we do not need the communalization of this conversation. So I think a lot of the amity and that tasalli, as you call it, Brigu, it has to come from these very small examples. We think that secularism needs these academic profundities. Actually, all it needs is two people to say we're friends. That's just what you need. You need two people to say we're friends. And somehow that speaks more to a mass than hectoring them, preaching them, telling them what their pluralism should be. So you're right. I mean, I really constantly look for the human story for that reason, because I think as an instrument of communication, also it is much more effective.
Yeah, no, sorry. The friends is very, very important, as you're saying, but the particular pressure points that are happening right now, say around dead bodies, what is happening to dead bodies is a particular source of anxiety. So those kinds of multiple pressure points, but absolutely. The very basic things on amity are right now making a huge difference. So thank you for that as well.
Right.
Patrick, do you have a second question?
I want to just come back to our earlier conversation about the local officials in the local state. As you said, I think absolutely correctly, both in addressing the pandemic and the welfare consequences, it's the frontline state that matters the most, right? Contact tracing, testing, getting food to people, collecting data, coordinating interventions requires a local actor who can coordinate different agencies, different actors, etc. So across your travels, can you just share with us your observations about the role that local state officials have played, places where they've been proactive and have helped migrant workers, places where they've been indifferent, places where they've been hampered by lack of autonomous decision-making powers, or any of your reflections about the local state, which I think just hasn't been discussed enough. And we know there's, across the country, tremendous variation in how local officials, district collectors have responded to the crisis, including the welfare dimensions of it.
So I think that's a great question, because while we've been talking about the need for effective centralization, what we haven't been speaking about is that this is really a crisis that's being fought at the micro units level of administration. And never before has the junior most position in the bureaucracy, in the civil services of the subdivisional magistrate and the district magistrate been as important as it is today. And we do see a district level variation, even as I travel through these states, between district magistrates, the local ground level bureaucrats who are more sort of responsive and more hands-on. And you will see that sometimes there are these bureaucrats. It could be small things. I mean, there's a magistrate who came back to work with her baby to work. I mean, she delivered a baby and she was back at work with that baby in her office. And everybody saw that. And you see that level of engagement. It was in Visakhapatnam, and I remember interviewing her. Or you can see a health worker, a government municipal health worker who decided to go and bury an infant baby who had died of the coronavirus. And again, that is a message to the community. So I think wherever district magistrates or government officials have been sensitive, even more than efficient, sensitive has mattered a lot in terms of how the community has responded to them, and in terms of how much the community is willing to listen to them. And I think to that extent, we have seen a number of examples of this in Kerala, but we've also seen examples of this in North India. For example, in the state of Rajasthan, one of the districts that was able to very effectively fight the coronavirus pandemic was Bhilwara. Bhilwara is a textile town, which was the first place in India to go under lockdown. Even before the rest of India went under lockdown, the textile town of Bhilwara was locked down, and literally led by its district magistrate, aggressive surveillance and contact tracing. And it had to seal off an entire hospital. The hospital of the city became the virus spreader, but it managed to trace every single person. And the thing is that you need cooperation of people to get that level of surveillance, right? So in other neighborhoods, people haven't been willing to volunteer that information. So the district magistrate's efficiency has really determined the outcome. But there's one thing that makes me slightly uncomfortable, that we've made it somewhat competitive on how districts perform. And while I understand the need for motivation and everybody wants to do well for their district, there are also other districts where officials are criminalizing hospitals where there has been a coronavirus spread. So for example, in Uttar Pradesh, in some towns, if a private hospital has X number of cases, there will be some criminal negligence case slapped on by the administration, who's worried that this is going to be a blot on her or his district. Now, what that does is it paralyzes the private medical system further. The private medical system in smaller towns is absent from this pandemic. This is very, very important for us to understand, that there are poor people who are going to get treated for cancer, for dialysis, for tuberculosis, and they are being denied this treatment at places they were usually able to get this treatment, because public hospitals are occupied with COVID and private hospitals are refusing to entertain people without coronavirus tests. So the poor non-COVID patient has nowhere to go. And if the response of the local administration is to criminalize everything, then private hospitals will simply opt out of the system, which is what we're seeing happening in a lot of small towns. So to that extent, how a district magistrate approaches the problem is really significant to the outcome of how that crisis is handled. And I think it's the best example we've seen thus far for decentralization. We have understood that a country as big and diverse as India cannot be governed without its local units functioning efficiently.
Yes, so it's 10:58 here. Basically 2 minutes left. If someone has a very quick question from the panel, we could still accommodate it before we thank Barkha for her. Anyone? All right. Yeah.
If I may just jump in kind of more, with a sort of slightly, personal question about reporting on a crisis like this and what it's been like for you as a journalist kind of out there on the front lines of a pandemic whose consequences we kind of still, it's unfolding by the day. And so just, what has it been like for you? Has this thrown up sort of new questions around kind of the ethics of reporting on a crisis like this? How have you dealt with it on a personal level? Would love to hear that as a sort of closing thought.
Okay. Yes. Yes, Barkha.
So look, the ethics of news gathering are never going to be fully resolved ever. There are always people who will believe that some reports are too intrusive. There are people who will believe that we didn't tell enough of a certain kind of stories and we should have told more of those stories. For myself, personally, I think over the years, I have developed the capacity to be empathetic but efficient while gathering the story of someone. But the damage comes home with you, right? There is no human being. I mean, unless I was a robot, I cannot see the scale of tragedy day after day, despair, pain, desolation, suicide, hunger, without it damaging me in some ways from inside, without it, not giving me sleepless nights. I don't remember the last time I slept in a restful sort of way. For the ethics, what I try and do is follow just a basic principle. I think I became a journalist to give voice to people who don't have a voice. I think I became a journalist not just to be popular, but to make people uncomfortable. I think it's important that your work makes at least some people uncomfortable all of the time. I think we try to find that balance between not being very graphic when we're talking about death and despair, when we're showing bodies, not thrusting mics in the faces of people who don't want to speak. But at the same time, we are fully aware that if these are people who want to tell their stories, and sometimes they're just so startled that somebody's interested in their story. I was standing at the railway station in Surat today, watching these migrant workers leave on the train to Bihar, and they started waving to me, and I was waving back, and I spent the next, they were just so happy that somebody was there when they were leaving, and somebody not from their world, not from their class, who was talking to them and waving. And that kind of engagement, it's a small thing, and it's so difficult to explain to somebody, but I felt so happy standing at that station saying, okay, bye, namaste, bye. And they felt happy. And so I think that your work has to try its best to retain the dignity of the subject of your story, but be aware that not all your tools will always be perfect, that you can go wrong. You can go wrong because you have split seconds sometimes to capture a moment. Your tone can sometimes not be sensitive enough. I think we learn. I think even 25 years later, I'm learning.
I think I speak for everyone here when I say that we are truly indebted to you, Barkha, for your heroic chronicling of suffering, human suffering, for your superb insights, how much you are educating us, enlightening us by being very bold and going into these searing locations and sites of suffering. And and thank you for your time, for your extraordinary overview of the pandemic in India. We will be in touch later. Thank you very, very much.